Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of State of Mind. This will be Part 10, Chapter 9, entitled Finish Line. It was dawn at Dagoba Beach, and Izuku sat on the sand, leaning back against his arms, watching the waves in the sky. This was his favorite time of the day, when the sky was lit up in a burst of blue, yellow, orange, and purple, when the sun was lowering, right before the world went dark. And this was his favorite place to watch it in, with all those brilliant colors reflected in the waves of the earth, making it look like the whole world was one, colored in hues of brilliant light. This had come to be his favorite place ever. He had spent almost every evening here since his episode in front of his entire class. Once he had recovered enough from his wounds, Izuku had begun training and practicing for the sports festival. There being usually no one at the beach at the late time that he was usually there. He ran, practiced his flips and gymnastic moves and his dodging and hand-to-hand combat with imaginary opponents. He practiced with both of his quirks as well when he was sure that no one was around, especially since it was technically illegal. He occasionally trained with All Might, but most of the time it was by himself, and he didn't really mind that anymore. Izuku had a good grasp of One for All, but he noticed that the longer he used it continuously, the more his muscles and even his bones began to ache. And then, with State of Mind, he was nervous to use it. It took him a lot longer to begin practicing with that one once he had started training again, the memory of everything that had happened to him at the USJ tearing at him and making his wounds ache with phantom pains. He didn't push that quirk very hard and was careful with it. He tried to use his right hand several times, wondering if 4 fingers would work, because, truthfully, it didn't make sense why it had to be 5 fingers. But he was never successful with just the 4. He still had the occasional incident where he forgot to put on his gloves or wrap a finger on his left hand in the mornings, though, and one particular incident was very embarrassing. Izuku had managed to walk from the couch and over to the kitchen where Mike and Aizawa were arguing about how to make a proper cup of coffee, when Izuku bashed his hip on the very edge of the table, throwing off his balance. Mike had instinctively reached out to grab him, and Izuku had latched onto his wrist. The voice hero had immediately disappeared, and Izuku had fallen onto his butt, leaving both Aizawa and Izuku in a stunned silence. "Oops," he had said innocently from his place on the floor. Aizawa had just sighed, and then raised his eyebrows, silently asking for his husband back. Izuku lifted a hand, and Mike sprung back into view in the middle of the kitchen, screeching, his quirk activated, all the glass in the room vibrating. Aizawa had had to use his quirk on him, and had been in such a bad mood for the rest of the day that even 1A had noticed it, avoiding their teacher's wrath. Aizawa and Mike had gifted him with a pair of gloves after that. They were nice, expensive. They were matte black, and only covered his thumb and his finger next to it. The rest of the glove was fingerless, and the right one was specially designed for his messed-up right hand. They were reinforced along the knuckles and had silver studs on the knuckles. They were also made of a reinforced material that shouldn't explode off his body like all his other clothes if he used One for All. Izuku loved them, and wore them every day after that. Now, Izuku had finished with his training for the day and was just enjoying the dawn from the still warm surface of the sand. He liked it at the beach. It was calm and serene, but eventually he headed back to where he was currently staying with Aizawa and Mike. It was that night that Mike randomly asked what Izuku planned on saying for his speech at the sports festival while he was playing with Wink. Izuku peered up at the hero, frowning. "My what?" Mike looked at him in obvious surprise. "You got first place in the entrance exam. You're going to be the one to give a speech when it starts." Izuku blinked rapidly, his brain shorting out. "Oh no," he breathed. Mike laughed and then patted his shoulder. "Don't worry, you'll do fine." Izuku looked at him in disbelief, before running to his bag to grab a notebook to begin working on a speech. The sports festival was rapidly approaching and everyone was training hard. Time passed quickly, and in the blink of an eye, it seemed, the morning of the sports festival had arrived. Izuku hadn't slept very well that night and had gotten up early for some coffee and to relax on the couch on his phone. Some of his other classmates, it seemed, were also up early, and they were texting in the group chat that they had made after Izuku had gotten out of the hospital. They had been using it more often since. He texted them for a while before clicking out of the app and then leaning against the back of the couch, his eyes closed, Wink on his lap. He meditated until Present Mike got up, not at all surprised that he was awake apparently, as he immediately asked him what he wanted for breakfast. "I don't need any," Izuku began, but Mike interrupted him. "How about bread and jam, something small? You need to eat something, little listener." At that, Izuku sighed but nodded, and stood up to walk over to the kitchen. He would never get used to someone preparing food for him, no matter how often he stayed with his teachers. Izuku sat down to eat as Mike handed him the bread and water. Soon Eraserhead was up as well, and they were all going about getting ready for the sports festival. The more time went on, the more his nerves bothered Izuku. He was soothed by watching his teachers calming auras, though. They weren't nervous in the slightest. Mike's was actually swelling with excitement. He was gushing about, narrating the event. Aizawa's aura was a calming cerulean, the color of the sky on a clear, sunny day. The man would probably be surprised to know that that was the color of his aura. Either way, their presences were calming, and with some meditation he was able to keep from panicking until they arrived at UA. The school was already bustling. Vendors lined either side of the entrance. Hundreds of people were steadily trickling in, already filling up the stadium, their voices and auras overwhelming Izuku. Colorful explosions buffeted at the air above the school. Anxiety was rising in him at the sight. Aizawa, who was driving and had seen how Izuku reacted to large groups of people with the reporters a while ago, made sure to park out of the way, where they could walk in without being bothered by anyone. Izuku noticed, and was grateful. Izuku nervously stepped out of the car and headed to their classroom. It was pure chaos after that, and Izuku was swept along with it, everyone getting dressed in their gym uniforms and then heading to the waiting rooms. Some of the class was more antsy than others, and all were generally wondering what the first event would be. Izuku was too nervous to sit down, instead pacing, much to the annoyance of those around him, including Kacchan, who yelled obscenities at him. Izuku, without even looking at the angry teen, flipped him off and continued to pace. Before Kacchan could react, Ida slammed the door to their room open, shouting at everyone. "Are you ready?" he exclaimed. "We'll be entering soon." Izuku's arms crossed around his torso as he tried to control his breathing. And that was when Todoroki approached him. "Midoriya," he said, stopping in front of him. Izuku noticed that his aura was much different than it usually was, with various shades of purples, yellows, white, and grays, all in a sea of red. Izuku blinked up at him, confused by the strong difference in the boy's aura. He'd never seen so many colors in a classmate before, let alone Todoroki. "Todoroki," Izuku gasped, put off by his intensity. His ungloved fingers were picking at his own nails. The rest of the class had somehow caught on to the intensity Todoroki was radiating as well, and had all turned their attention to him. "What's wrong?" he hesitantly asked the dual-haired teen. "Looking at things objectively, I think I'm stronger than you," he said. Izuku recoiled in surprise. Another declaration of war, then. "I know All Might has his eye on you," Todoroki added, and Izuku's eyes widened. The boy shook his head. "I'm not trying to pry about it. All it means is that I will beat you. I will be better than you." Izuku's eyes narrowed, a sudden desire to beat the guy that he had come to consider his friend, filling him as the rest of the class had filled the air with noise that was just background chatter to Izuku. Izuku was surprised by that. He'd never had a particular will to beat anyone at anything before. Kirishima was first to react, running up to Todoroki and laying a hand on his shoulder. Hey, why are you picking a fight all of a sudden?" "It's all right, Kirishima," Izuku found himself saying, his eyes having never left Todoroki's. An animalistic smile spread across Izuku's face, and Kirishima stepped back, sweat dropping. "If Todoroki thinks that he can beat me so easily, let him try." "Oh, man," Kaminari said. The aura in the room had dropped considerably. Todoroki nodded at him, pleased with that answer, and turned to walk away. "Todoroki," Izuku said, and the teen looked back at him. "Let's both try our best." The corner of his new rival's mouth quirked up in a rare display of emotion. From his side, Kirishima blinked at Izuku in surprise. The rest of the room was stuck in a stunned silence until Ida cleared his throat. "Okay, everyone, let's head to the lineup," and they all filed out of the room. Izuku's anxiety had surprisingly lessened. He noticed as they waited, Present Mike's voice screaming from outside. Izuku had his words tuned out for the most part, focusing on holding on to whatever fighting spirit had made him respond to Todoroki's challenge, so he didn't notice that they were supposed to be moving forward until Ida tapped his shoulder from next to him. And then they were walking, and the light was getting brighter, and oh crap, there were like billions of people. Izuku fought to remain calm, focusing on the familiar auras of his classmates as they approached the middle of the arena. There are so many people, he gasped out, thinking about how he would be giving his speech in mere minutes. Will we be able to give our best performance with so many people watching? Ida wondered, from next to him. This is part of the training to become a hero. Izuku considered that. The class rep was right. Heroes had so much attention on them, it was important for them to handle it well and with strength that Izuku lacked. He needed to focus. He needed to be better. He forced himself to stand up straighter, to stop picking at his nails, and to appear more confident despite how he felt on the inside. The rest of the classes were announced as they converged. The R-rated hero Midnight stood on the pedestal. Apparently she would be their chief umpire. The rest of the class grumbled about what she was wearing, but Izuku didn't understand why it could possibly matter. It didn't affect anything at all. Izuku watched as she first announced herself, and then Izuku. Izuku's heart rose into his throat when she said his name, but he forced himself to walk forward, hands clenched and fists at his sides. He climbed up the pedestal to stand in front of the microphone facing the crowd, his back to his classmates. He couldn't see their auras, so he forced himself to focus on Yagi's, whom he could see among the teachers, barely. Izuku took a deep, steadying breath, and then spoke. I pledge to do my best, he began, back ramrod straight, eyes on Yagi's calming aura. UA's first years are going to make themselves known. We're going to show everyone what we can do. Izuku considered the other classes' declarations on their first day back after the USJ attack. Every single one of us has gone through innumerable things to get to this point, and we're going to fight for our spot and show the world that we are here. The stands erupted in applause and cheers, even the students behind him cheering along, short and to the point. Izuku gave a stiff bow and then turned, walking down the steps and rejoining his classmates, ignoring the fact that Kachan was pointedly looking away from him. Kirishima slapped him on the back. That was so manly, dude. Izuku weakly smiled at him, as Ida congratulated him from his other side. Midnight also took to the stage again. Now, let's get started, she announced. Every year, many drink their tears here. Here is the fateful first game. She threw her whip up, the screen scrolling like a lottery wheel, eventually stopping on obstacle race. Izuku tilted his head at that, considering. With his original quirk and One for All, an obstacle race was near perfect for him. He couldn't underestimate it, though. This was UA, and lots of students had amazing quirks. Out of the corner of his eye, Izuku saw Todoroki. He was one of those with an amazing quirk, and he had challenged him. Izuku would do his best, just as he had said. Midnight went on to explain that all 11 classes would be participating, and that as long as they stayed on the course, it didn't matter what they did. Izuku found that interesting. It didn't matter what they did, meaning they didn't have to worry about holding back. All of the classes took their places in front of a very narrow path. Izuku knew what would happen. Todoroki would blast the area with his eyes to propel himself forward. He didn't know everyone's quirks, but he knew his classmates as well at this point. Jumping would be the best technique to get ahead. Izuku crouched as the lights began counting down to the start signal. He would use One for All to leap up to the wall and then propel himself rapidly from side to side. It should work. The lights began clicking off. Izuku narrowed his eyes. He needed to show Yagi that he was not wrong in picking him as a successor. He needed to show him and the world how capable he is. He needed to go above and beyond. The last light clicked off and Midnight screamed, "Start!" And Izuku was off like a bolt of lightning, shooting straight into the wall. It fractured around him as he slammed into it, caving it in even further as he jumped off of it and into the parallel wall immediately, bouncing from wall to wall like Gran Torino. From behind, a blast of cold air hit his back, but he ignored it, forcing himself forward, power rushing through his body, his breath even but fast. Izuku broke out into the light just as the ice reached the end of the tunnel. Izuku flew through the air, Todoroki running almost directly underneath him. He glanced back quickly to see almost everyone else frozen on the ground, just like he thought would happen. Unsurprisingly, almost all of his classmates had avoided the icy mess, charging forward ahead of the mass of students. "Deku!" Kachan's voice screamed from behind him, but Izuku ignored it. Izuku's anxiety was falling away, replaced with adrenaline and excitement. He loved this. This was already the funnest thing Izuku had ever done, and wasn't that surprising? He had not expected to be able to get over his anxiety, let alone actually enjoy himself, but enjoying himself he was. And that was when he narrowly missed being blasted out of the air by a robot. He landed, looking up at the same robots from the entrance exam. Izuku acted fast, but so did Todoroki. Izuku leapt up to Detroit, smashed the shit out of the robots just as the dual-haired boy literally froze them, causing Izuku's punch to explode them into giant frozen pieces of junk. The blast propelled him even farther and higher, and after a second he realized he was cackling in maniacal glee as wind whistled past his ears. Around the arena, his crazed face was being shown on every TV, and his laughter was driving slivers of shock and fear into the hearts of everyone watching, though he didn't know it. "That kid really is something else," President Mike said, surprisingly lower voice than usual. Aizawa gave a grunt of agreement. Izuku landed in front of what looked like an abyss, peppered with tiny landing pads that had ropes connected to each one. He could clearly see the other side. "Too fucking easy." Izuku cackled. He crouched, powering up, and jumped at an angle, vaulting over Todoroki, who was icing the ropes and skating on them, and over the entire abyss, landing in a run on the other side. Izuku could hear Kachan's explosions behind them, but he strangely didn't care. Where did all this confidence come from, he wondered. The thrill of the race was really something else. Pretty soon, he reached a polka-dotted field, and he hesitated before he tuned Mike back in and heard him describing this obstacle as a minefield. "Really?" Izuku muttered dryly. He jumped again. He didn't even jump as hard this time, but he hit the wall of the tunnel again, using his momentum to jump onto the next wall and use the same tactic as before, bouncing from wall to wall and then landing right behind the finish line, ducking into a roll, and then literally rolling across the finish line and into first place, laughing the entire way. The crowd was screaming as confetti rained down upon him, sticking in his fluffy hair. Izuku pulled himself up just as Todoroki and then Kachan passed the finish line. The latter was fuming, smoke rising from his hands. Izuku grinned at Todoroki, offering a thumbs up, as the rest of the classes began reaching the finish line. Somewhere unknown, a man watched Izuku's face, portrayed as the winner, across the screen. The man scratched his neck angrily, remembering how it felt to disintegrate that very same boy's finger. The man was furious at the boy and wanted to hurt him. He needed to show that boy why he was someone to be afraid of. Somewhere else in Japan, a woman watched the same thing. The boy on the screen had long green hair on one side of his head, held back with silver pins. The other side of his head had short hair, a huge scar marring the surface of his skin. Despite that, a huge, crazed smile was lighting up his tired, malachite eyes. Midoriya Inko fell into a whirlwind of regret and guilt at having abandoned her son, to where he hadn't felt the need to tell her about acquiring a wound as bad as the one that caused the scar on his head. Pride filled her heart nonetheless, and she considered sending him a text, telling him that she was proud of him. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 9 of State of Mind. Chapter 10 will be up next. Let me know your thoughts and reactions to the introduction of the sports festival here, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.